She didn't cry, she didn't beg. She whispered a prayer, kissed the crucifix, and waited. The axe came down, but not cleanly. The first blow missed her neck and smashed into the back of her head. A sickening crack echoed through the chamber. Blood poured from her hair. Mary was still conscious, still breathing. The crowd gasped, some wept, but the executioner raised the axe again. She was Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, granddaughter of Henry VII, and she was about to experience one of the most botched executions in royal history. The executioner would swing that axe 2 more times before her suffering finally ended. And the woman who signed her death warrant was her own cousin, Elizabeth I, who kept Mary prisoner for 19 years. But Elizabeth didn't kill Mary out of hatred. She killed her out of fear. Fear of rebellion, fear of losing her throne, and fear that in Mary's face she saw her own downfall. This is the true story of 2 queens, 1 crown, and the cold-blooded game that left one of them headless. If stories like this matter to you, give this video a like. It helps more people discover the dark truths history tried to bury. Mary's story begins in the stone corridors of Linlithgow Palace on December 8, 1542. She wasn't supposed to become queen. Her father, James V of Scotland, was only 30 and expected to live for decades. But fate had other plans. James died just 6 days after Mary's birth, making her Queen of Scotland when she was barely a week old. Imagine that, a newborn baby taking over a kingdom torn apart by war, religious conflict, and political chaos. The Scottish nobles immediately began fighting over who would control this infant queen, and through her, the entire country. Her mother, Marie de Guise, came from powerful French nobility, and that changed everything for Mary. Let me explain to you why. Marie knew Scotland alone couldn't protect her daughter from the ambitions of Henry VIII, who wanted to force a marriage between baby Mary and his son Edward. That would join Scotland and England under English rule forever. So when Mary was just 5 years old, her mother made a decision that would shape everything that followed. She sent Mary to France, to the court of King Henry II, where she'd be raised as a French princess and eventually marry the Dauphin Francis. For 13 years, Mary lived in the most sophisticated court in Europe. She learned to speak French, Latin, Italian, and Spanish. She wrote poetry, played instruments, and danced at fancy parties. She was tall, graceful, and considered one of the most beautiful princesses in Europe. But she was also being raised for a very specific purpose. In 1558, when Mary was just 15, she married Francis, the heir to the French throne. For a brief moment, it seemed like she had won the ultimate prize. She would be Queen of Scotland and France. The girl who had been sent away as a vulnerable child had returned as one of the most powerful women in Europe. But Mary's childhood in France had a dark side. She had been raised Catholic in a world that was turning more Protestant. She spoke French better than Scots. She learned polite behavior at the French court, but she didn't understand the harsh truth of Scottish politics. The fancy princess was about to return to a country she barely remembered, and the Scottish nobles were waiting. There's something about those Scottish nobles that explains why Mary never stood a chance. Let's have a look at why this matters. These Scottish nobles had been running Scotland without a monarch for 18 years while Mary lived in France. They weren't just welcoming back their queen, they were losing their power to a teenage girl who didn't understand their country. The first warning sign came when Mary was just 16. Her young husband, Francis, became King of France, making her queen of 2 countries. But instead of celebrating quietly, Mary made a huge mistake. She began using the English coat of arms, claiming she was the rightful Queen of England, too. It sounds bold, but Mary had been raised in a French court that taught her she was the rightful heir. She had tutors, courtiers, and Catholic advisors reinforcing that idea from childhood. She wasn't being reckless, she was being loyal to the identity she'd been groomed to believe in. Elizabeth's spies immediately reported back to London. Here was Mary, young and ambitious, publicly declaring that Elizabeth was illegitimate and that she, Mary, should rule England. The second mistake was even worse. Mary refused to sign the Treaty of Edinburgh, which would have recognized Elizabeth's right to the English throne. Again, pride and principle were tangled. She wasn't just rejecting a treaty, she was refusing to erase the version of herself she'd grown up believing. But here's what Mary didn't understand about the world she was entering. There was room for only one queen in Europe, and courtiers and conspirators around both cousins were already choosing sides. In 1560, everything changed again. Francis II died suddenly. Mary was just 18, a young widow with a big decision to make. She could stay in France as the Dowager Queen, living in comfort but with no real power, or she could return to Scotland and take the throne she'd inherited as a baby, even though she barely knew the place. Mary chose power. In August 1561, she left France and sailed back to Scotland. When her ship came out of the morning fog at Leith Harbor, the people stood waiting. It was the first time they were seeing their queen in person. She was tall, almost 6 feet, with med-brown hair and striking hazel eyes. She wore black mourning clothes that made her pale skin stand out. The crowd went quiet, then suddenly burst into cheers. But Scotland wasn't anything like the fancy French court Mary had just left. Edinburgh was cold and gray. It was ruled by strict Protestant leaders, especially John Knox, who preached that women shouldn't rule at all. Mary was Catholic, raised in France, and used to luxury, everything these men hated. Still, somehow Mary made it work. She was politically intelligent enough to promise religious tolerance. She attended Protestant services while hearing Catholic Mass privately in her chambers. She spoke to the Scottish Parliament in Scots, not French, winning over nobles who had expected a foreign princess. For 4 years, Mary successfully balanced the competing demands of Scottish politics. Her court became the center of Renaissance culture in Scotland. Poets competed for her attention, musicians played at elaborate masques, and visiting ambassadors reported back to their kings about the extraordinary young woman who seemed to have inherited the best qualities of both the Scottish stewards and French royalty. Mary also understood that her greatest weapon was her marriage potential. Every eligible prince in Europe wanted to marry the beautiful Queen of Scots. Philip II of Spain considered her. The Archduke Charles of Austria sent ambassadors. Even Elizabeth I's own favorite, Robert Dudley, was proposed as a potential husband. But Mary was playing a much more dangerous game than anyone realized. She wasn't just looking for a husband, she was looking for a path to the English throne. Her grandmother, Margaret Tudor, had been Henry VIII's sister, making Mary Elizabeth's heir until Elizabeth had her own children. Every marriage negotiation was really about which alliance would best position Mary to claim England when Elizabeth died. Mary's beauty and political skill were making her the most dangerous person in Europe, at least from Elizabeth's perspective. Every day that Mary remained unmarried and therefore available, she represented a potential threat to Elizabeth's reign. And then Mary made the decision that would destroy everything. In 1565, she met her cousin, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, and fell desperately in love. Darnley was tall, handsome, and like Mary, he had a claim to the English throne through his Tudor grandmother. Together, their children would have an even stronger claim to England than either of them alone. What Mary didn't realize was that Elizabeth was watching this courtship with growing alarm. Not because Elizabeth was plotting against her, but because Elizabeth understood something Mary didn't.
Conspirators around them were using their rivalry to advance their power. The trap wasn't set by Elizabeth. It was set by a system that demanded these two women destroy each other. But there's something about how the people around Mary manipulated her choice that I haven't told you yet. Something that shows how little control she really had.
The Scottish lords and English courtiers had been pushing Darnley toward Mary for months. They told her he was the perfect choice, handsome, royal, and politically advantageous. What they didn't tell her was that Darnley was violently unstable and that they were counting on him to destroy her from within. Mary married Darnley in July 1565, and within months she realized she had walked into a nightmare. Darnley wasn't just arrogant and demanding, he was violent, jealous, and possibly mentally unstable. He wanted to be named King of Scotland, not just the Queen's consort. When Mary refused, he began plotting against her. What was Mary thinking? How could someone so politically shrewd have been so blind about the man she was marrying? The answer lies in something we recognize today. She was trapped in an abusive relationship and couldn't see the warning signs until it was too late. Darnley's jealousy focused on David Rizzio, Mary's Italian secretary and musician. Rizzio was a small, ugly man who posed no romantic threat, but he had Mary's ear, and Darnley's paranoia convinced him that Rizzio was plotting against him. In March 1566, Darnley and a group of Scottish lords burst into Mary's private chambers while she was having dinner with Rizzio. Mary was 6 months pregnant at the time. They dragged Rizzio screaming from the room and stabbed him 56 times just outside her door. Mary was forced to listen to her friend's murder while Darnley held her at knife point, threatening to kill her unborn child if she tried to help Rizzio. This was the moment Mary should have realized how trapped she had become. But she was pregnant, alone, and surrounded by men who had just demonstrated they were willing to commit murder. Instead of fleeing, Mary did what abuse victims often do. She convinced herself she could manage the situation. She gave birth to her son James in June 1566, securing the succession. But her marriage to Darnley continued to deteriorate. He was drinking heavily, possibly suffering from syphilis, and making increasingly erratic demands. The Scottish nobles were pressuring Mary to either control her husband or get rid of him entirely. But what happened next reveals something terrifying about the system Mary was trapped in. The same schemers who had pushed Mary toward Darnley were now whispering that she needed to eliminate him. Mary met James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. That's when everything took a darker turn. Bothwell wasn't just Mary's choice. He was being positioned by rival Scottish factions as the strong man who could solve Mary's Darnley problem. Once again, Mary thought she was making her own decision, but she was actually following a script written by people who wanted to use her downfall to seize power. Bothwell was everything Darnley wasn't: strong, decisive, and completely loyal to Mary. He was also married, Protestant, and had a reputation for violence that made even hardened Scottish nobles nervous. But Mary was desperate for someone she could trust, and Bothwell seemed like her salvation. In February 1567, Darnley was staying at a house called Crook o' Field, supposedly recovering from illness. Mary visited him there on the evening of February 9th, then left to attend a wedding celebration. That night, Crook o' Field exploded. When the smoke cleared, Darnley's body was found in the garden. Not killed by the explosion, but strangled. Everyone knew Bothwell had organized the murder, and everyone suspected Mary had known about it too. But Mary's next decision sealed her fate completely. 3 months later, she married Bothwell. Not only had she apparently conspired in her husband's murder, but she had married his killer. The Scottish people who had welcomed her home 6 years earlier turned against her completely. They could forgive a queen who made political mistakes, but they couldn't forgive one who broke every moral boundary. But there's something about what happened next that shows how the system was designed to destroy both queens. The Scottish lords who had orchestrated Mary's downfall immediately sent word to Elizabeth, offering to hand over their former queen. And this was the moment Elizabeth's worst fears came true. Elizabeth didn't want Mary in England, but once she arrived, she wasn't about to let her go. Sending her back to Scotland could start another war. Letting her leave might spark rebellion. Killing her would make Elizabeth the first queen to execute another crowned queen. So Elizabeth did what she always did, nothing. She locked Mary away and hoped time would solve the problem. But her advisors had other ideas. To them, Mary was a threat that needed to be removed. At the Battle of Carberry Hill in 1567, Mary's army fell apart without a real fight. The woman who once ruled a kingdom now stood alone with barely 100 men left at her side. Bothwell fled to Denmark, where he was imprisoned and eventually died insane. Mary was taken to the island fortress of Loch Leven and forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son James. She was 24 years old, and her reign as Queen of Scots was over. And Mary still had one card to play. In May 1568, she escaped from Loch Leven and raised another army. When that army was defeated at the Battle of Langside, Mary faced a choice that would determine the rest of her life. She could flee to France, where she would be safe but powerless, or she could cross the border into England and throw herself on the mercy of her cousin Elizabeth. Mary chose Elizabeth. She believed that one queen would help another, that family loyalty would triumph over political games. But she was about to learn just how wrong she could be. And there's something about Elizabeth's choice that will shock you, something we're about to uncover, revealing the true cost of wearing a crown. Elizabeth didn't just imprison Mary to protect her throne. She kept her alive for 19 years because killing a fellow queen immediately would have horrified every monarch in Europe. Elizabeth needed Mary to destroy herself completely first, and she was willing to wait decades for it to happen. For 19 years, Mary lived in a series of English castles and manor houses, writing letters, embroidering, and slowly going mad with boredom and desperation. But even in prison, Mary couldn't escape the system that had destroyed her in Scotland. Catholic conspirators kept approaching her with plots to kill Elizabeth and put Mary on the English throne, whether Mary wanted to participate or not. Finally, in 1586, Mary made her final fatal error. Or maybe the error was made for her. She agreed to participate in the Babington plot to assassinate Elizabeth. Her letters approving the conspiracy were intercepted, giving Elizabeth's advisors the evidence they had been waiting 19 years to find. Elizabeth agonized for months over signing Mary's death warrant. She knew that killing Mary would solve her political problems, but it would also make her the first English monarch to execute a fellow queen. In the end, the pressure from her advisors became too much to resist. On February 8, 1587, Mary walked into the Great Hall of Fotheringhay Castle wearing a black dress and a white veil. She was 44 years old, gray-haired, and walked with a limp from years of imprisonment. But she carried herself like the queen she had always been. She laid her head on the wooden block and whispered, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." The executioner raised his axe and brought it down with tremendous force, but his aim was terrible. Instead of severing her neck cleanly, the blade crashed into the back of Mary's skull. She was still alive, blood pouring from the wound as the horrified crowd watched. The executioner had to swing twice more before Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, finally died. Even in death, she couldn't escape the brutality that had defined her life. Here's the final twist. Mary's son James, inherited the English throne when Elizabeth died childless in 1603. The system that had demanded these two women destroy each other ultimately gave victory to Mary's bloodline anyway. The woman Elizabeth was forced to execute to protect her crown had already won through her child. Elizabeth lived with the guilt of Mary's execution for the rest of her life. She had been forced to choose between being a queen and being a woman, between political survival and family loyalty. The crown demanded she kill her cousin, and she obeyed. Sometimes the real enemy isn't the person across the chessboard, it's the game itself. What do you think? Were Mary and Elizabeth victims of the system that demanded two rulers destroy each other? Or could they have found another way? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and please like this video to help us reach more history lovers like yourself.